Hello, everyone. So, today we're going to be talking a little bit about the interwar years, looking at what happens after the Treaty of Versailles is finished being negotiated in Germany, and what happens in Germany after the Treaty of Versailles was negotiated, really, is what we're looking at. And then, let's see here, gotta go to resources. And then this should be a relatively short lecture because I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail today. I'll talk more about it on Friday. I'm just really worn out. I lectured a lot yesterday. So we're going to talk a little bit about things, and then I'm going to put up two assignments for you, one pertaining to yesterday, one pertaining to today, to give you some opportunities for more points. And then those will both be due on Friday. But first I need to go here, and I need to go to group. Okie dokie. Back here. Let's see. So when World War I comes to a close, I mentioned a couple of times now that it's definitely a signal to Europeans in general, but really the whole world. But it's a signal that things are changing. And simply put, the world had never seen a conflict like World War I before. It's the first time that we see industrialization applied to warfare. And so it has a major effect on not only the people who were intimately involved with the war and came home from wartime experiences, but it also, due to the amount of devastation that it wreaked upon the European population in terms of number of deaths and various other things, people are really coming out of this very culturally traumatized, is the best way that I can put it. And because they're so culturally traumatized, they start to really question what they believe about the world. And it's at this time, I mentioned before already, which is kind of why this lecture is going to be a little short, because some of this stuff I've already talked about. But during the interwar years, people are questioning all sorts of things, previously held beliefs that they had about everything to do with the European identity or the European character. So everything that people understood about Europeans being rational, reasonable humans who, have somehow reached this peak of development in the start of the 20th century, goes by the wayside, and people are very rattled, for lack of a better word. And this entire era following World War I, but the entire era following World War I is what we might deem an age of uncertainty, okay, or an age of anxiety. People are super tense to see what happens next, now that the whole fabric of European society was torn apart by World War I. And there's a brand new geopolitical landscape, and the United States is now emerging as the top economic force in the world. So the age of anxiety, World War I resulted in an end to the old order of everything, and it creates this age of anxiety. It was a staggering blow to Western civilization. Many people felt as if the world that they knew had been completely turned upside down, that they had very little control to change things for the better. And people saw themselves living really in a perpetual state of crisis all the way up until 1950, and frankly, maybe even a little bit beyond the 50s, because then you have the prospect after the end of World War II. Now you have the prospect of nuclear war, right? And nuclear war could destroy the entire planet by the time that we get to the early 50s. So there's a whole lot of anxiety. Modern philosophy changes. We see people starting to take a look at the human character from a completely different standpoint, which is to embrace almost this sense of meaninglessness to everything. And so there's a philosophical school called existentialism, the root word which is exist or existence. So when we talk about existentialism, we're talking about a brand of philosophy that focuses on the meaning of existence. And after World War I, as you can imagine, there's a whole lot of people that feel like, kind of what's the point? What the whole if everything is meaningless, if everything's destined to die, if humans are destined to destroy each other, then what's the point of any of it? And they essentially, existentialism is about coming to the conclusion that there is no meaning to any of it, that everything is inherently in itself meaningless. And that the only true meaning, there is no universal meaning to anything. There's no omnipotent understanding of the quality of meaningfulness to anything in the world. Everything that has meaning is individually ascribed by a person, and so. This is one of the harder concepts in some way to wrap your head around as a 10th grader because, frankly, when you're young, and this is true of anyone, including myself, you have a whole lot of things that you look at in the world as having meaning for meaning's sake. And it could be relationships, or it could be material things, or it could be whatever. And as you get older, particularly, and some people never really make this transition, I guess, but particularly when you're confronted with traumas, significant traumas, as World War I was, but also on an individual level, you're confronted with the traumas of loss and other things. It forces you to readjust your understanding of what has meaning when you've lost what has meaning. And I think that everybody at some point or another goes through a period of loss, but the extent to which that this breaks down their entire existential understanding of their individual identity is where the bridge may not always be the same. So, there are people who go through terrible, terrible things that cause them to have a complete disintegration of ego, we'll say. And they're left trying to pick up the pieces to understand, well, if I've lost everything that's meaningful to me and everything seems meaningless, then what's the point? And then the other side of that is that when you come to a place of acceptance about the inherent state of meaninglessness, according to, I'm still talking about existentialism, according to the philosophy of existentialism, it's only when you inherently accept that everything doesn't have meaning that you then have the freedom or agency or power to begin creating meaning in anything. And so all meaning is meaning that is created, not just found or possessed or some sort of universal immutable trait, right? So the process of creating meaning is really what existentialism is all about. That existence is individually determined by the historical actor, we'll say. And this is a really profound thing, right? Because it gives people who have a total sense of a loss of control over their life, particularly in this era, in the 1920s and 30s, where you have the devastation from World War I, and then it's a 1-2 combo punch with the stock market crash and the Great Depression that immediately follow. And so, people are really struggling during the interwar years to grab onto anything that seemingly will bring their life some sort of sense of purpose. And that's really what, for the educated segments of the population who begin to study existentialism as a philosophy and nihilism and other things like that, this is kind of the direction in which that goes. So new ideas in philosophy, new ideas in psychology. We talked about Sigmund Freud. Also, there, because of the devastation, there seems to be more so after World War II than World War I, but this expectation that governments will somehow put into place measures that will help with the rebuilding process. And then new ideas. Sorry, that's kind of a random statement there, but I didn't want to forget to mention it because I was just scrolling past it. Also new ideas in science with physics, quantum physics, Max Planck, and extensions on that study by Albert Einstein with the theory of relativity. And then you have new art movements between different styles of art. We see now modern art, which breaks all the conventional boundaries. Again, what's the meaning of art? We can take that idea of meaning and apply it to really anything, right? What's the meaning of art? Well, there had been all of these conventional rules that for years had been accepted truths about science and about art and about literature and about how you do things and how things work and the natural laws of things and reason and all the rest of it. And when all that goes out the window after World War I, you start to see people break down boundaries and create new meaningful pieces that do away with all of the preconceived notions of proper art in particular. In the 1910s, 20s, 30s, with Pablo Picasso, for example, with the Cubist art style, which in a previous era, the masters of the Renaissance would have looked at Pablo Picasso's art and said, was this done by a 5-year-old? They would not have had any understanding about the significance of it. But that's almost the exact reason why it's significant, is because in an earlier era, nobody would have probably looked twice at Pablo Picasso's work. But Pablo Picasso was one of the few artists actually who gained some degree of renown in his lifetime. He's very well known by the time that he dies, and he has an entirely new take on art, which is very abstract art that is sharp angles and geometrical and bright colors and seemingly doesn't make sense, but then neither does their world. And if art is a reflection of culture, then we have to understand that the art would seemingly not make sense unless you understood that everything else in their culture also didn't make sense at that time. So hopefully that resonates with you. We also see the development of motion pictures, new technologies that had previously been used for wartime purposes start to be now used and developed for civilian purposes. So over the course of the 1920s and 30s, we see significant jumps forward in automobile technology. For example, cars start to have inflated rubber tires on them rather than stiff wooden wheels. They start to put things like shocks and other stuff into cars to smooth the ride out. Also, just design quality wise, cars start to become really works of art in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There's a lot of designers from all sorts of different places, but a lot of designers in particularly Germany and America and so on, who when the war ends, they send some of these top engineers into the workforce, and they start doing work for private companies like Ford and whatever else, and really designing beautiful body styles for vehicles. They start putting bumpers on cars. Now, of course, by modern day standards, the cars that they're developing in those times would be nowhere near as comfortable as a modern day car is. But that's not true in all cases. There are some really nice ones, I guess. But just in general, the design style of them is unique, and that's one thing that's a major change. Also, airplanes undergo significant development during the interwar years times. Radio is another technology that comes about during World War I and is expanded after World War I, and we start to see the development of public radio stations where broadcasts are put over the airwaves. People start buying large furniture style Art Deco designed radios to put into their home, the tall ones. They're usually about 2 or 3 feet tall, maybe about two feet wide, and everybody has a radio in the house. And in a time before television, which doesn't emerge until the late 50s, radio is the thing where people come together, brings the family together after dinner or whatever. They sit around and listen to the radio. Kids play with toys. Dad reads the paper. Mom's knitting there, and it's kind of your general bourgeois, upper middle class idea probably of what folks looked like. Remember that most folks still, in many places in the world at that point live in rural areas, even in the United States and in Europe. We don't really make the transition until to a completely urban style living until a little bit later. And even today, not everybody's completely urban. It's just a lot more than it used to be 100 years ago. But they're, in those cases, maybe they're too far outside of the range of a radio station or something like that. So certainly not everybody had a radio in their house. You could only afford one if you made enough money to have one. But for the folks who were able to have enough disposable income in the 1920s and 30s to be able to go out and purchase a radio, that would be how they would spend maybe their evenings together. And the radio wasn't just about music back in those days. They used to do all sorts of different, it was not just music and news. They had those things, but they also had other things like live soap operas, live orchestras on the radio, and then of course radio becomes a huge avenue for advertising and expanding the consumer style economy. So that gives you kind of a rough idea of some of the developments that happen during the age of anxiety. But we need to move over and start talking a little bit about kind of the political developments of the 1920s. So those are all kind of more social history, cultural developments. And now we're going to start talking about the fragility of democracy in the era just following World War I. See, a lot of people, World War I wasn't exactly a comforting event when it came to people's understanding of the role of democracy. A lot of people after the war are really afraid that maybe democracy isn't for Europe. Remember that it wasn't until we saw the age of mass politic and imperialism develop that the road to World War I started to be paved by conservative nationalism and stuff. And so there's not a lot of faith in Europe about democratic styles of government fitting the European landscape. Nonetheless, despite all of these fears and trepidations surrounding the role of democracy, many democracies are instituted in places that really don't have a whole lot of history with democracy, namely Germany, which is the most significant democratic government that we need to talk about in the age of anxiety. The Weimar Republic, which is spelled WEIMAR, but remember W's in German are pronounced as V's, so Weimar Republic. There's also a significant fear of the other side of the spectrum, which is communism. And so people would rather see democratic governments continue to proliferate rather than communism, of course, because communism results in single-party rule and totalitarianism and other things like that. Not that people necessarily knew that as well as we do now, but communism was a threat to the complete disintegration of a global market capitalist democratic style geopolitical world order. And so communism as a response to World War I and the fears of democracy emerges for the first time in the Soviet Union. People are terrified of the prospect of communism in the Soviet Union, and potentially, as Marx once suggested, having that communist revolution spread to other places that would have created a completely new global framework and potentially had, devastating consequences. So let's talk a bit about the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic is accused, as I mentioned in the last video or two videos ago, as being as stabbing Germany in the back. They're accused of the stab in the back, or sometimes it's known as the Diktat, D-I-K-T-A-T, meaning the dictated peace. Okay, dictated peace. And so the Diktat is how Germans start to refer to as the Treaty of Versailles. The Weimar Republic faces threats from all sides almost immediately as a result of losing the confidence of the German people by signing and agreeing to the Treaty of Versailles, which of course included that really harsh Article 231 that had put sole blame of the war on Germany and required Germany to pay enormous reparations to Britain and France. So they do create a new constitution in Germany under the new Weimar Republic. Female suffrage was granted at that time. But you have threats from the left, meaning you had all sorts of radicals from the left who hated the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic during that time, early on, had to defend itself using bands of now out of work German soldiers who are humiliated and angry. And this included in particular a group called the Freikorps, F-R-E-I-K-O-R-P-S, Freikorps is how it's said. And this was a right-wing paramilitary group that formed after the war, and they really became the vanguard of anti-communism in Germany, because remember, communism is a threat in all places where democracies are unstable. And so this, hurts the Weimar Republic's prestige, because, the government was given support by the military, provided that the government maintained discipline in the army and root out Bolshevism. But you're giving credence to a bunch of people who should otherwise have probably not really found a place after World War I results in Germany being defeated. So you have immediately after the defeat of Germany, there's really no period of humiliation of the German military. The highest ranking members of the German military managed to retain some degree of national respect because of all of the anger and hostility in Germany surrounding the Treaty of Versailles. So, now, beyond that, you also have threats to the Weimar Republic from the right. So there are a number of different conservative politicians and businessmen who end up receiving help from some of these disgruntled army officers who end up trying to overthrow the government in what was known as the KAPP, K-A-P-P, Putsch of 1920. And so during this time, right-wing conservatives are making a move against the Weimar Republic to try to topple it and establish a more military dictatorship type thing. There's all sorts of crazy things that happen, and at the end of the day, the good news is that the KAPP Putsch does not manage to forcefully overthrow the government. But on the other side, they do continue to gain seats in the Reichstag, and eventually the kind of the government that had been dominated by the Social Democratic Party, the previously largest party of the Reichstag under Kaiser Wilhelm II, eventually withdrew from the government. And this left a really fragile coalition in charge. And that's the other thing about the Weimar Republic, is if you imagine the American government being a pie, basically that pie is more or less divided 50-50 between Democrat and Republican. Well, the pie in Germany isn't 50-50. There's a bunch of different slices in it. And because none of them have a simple majority in the Reichstag, they're forced to rely on other political parties teaming up with one another to get things passed. Meanwhile, the German economy is sinking faster than the Titanic. The Ruhr crisis of 1923 was where the reparations from there's an area known as the Ruhr region, R-U-H-R region. And the French occupy that entire industrial Ruhr region of France. And this was because France dominated the Saar coal mines, the Ruhr industrial region, in order to extract materials, goods, products, all sorts of things from Germany as part of the reparations repayment plan, as the Treaty of Versailles had laid out. So, one of the things that happens in the Ruhr region is that the Weimar Republic, as a response to the tanking economy in Germany, tells the workers in the Ruhr region, which were German workers, to stop working and passively resist the French occupation there, so that the French will not be able to continue to extract materials from that area. Meanwhile, the government of Germany, the Weimar Republic, is printing out just huge sums, unfathomably huge sums of money in an effort to try to repay Britain and France. But what ended up happening was that a situation developed called runaway inflation, which is where they're printing so much money that the value of the German mark, which was the currency of Germany at the time, completely falls out from underneath it. And so the value of the German mark went from approximately, you used to, back in 1919, when the war first ended, if you brought $1, one American dollar, to Germany, you could get about 9 marks. Okay, you could get about 9 marks for $1. In 1923, if you brought $1 to Germany, you might be able to get, at the height of the hyperinflation, 4.2 trillion marks. Okay, 4.2 trillion marks for $1. Now, although that's obviously a ridiculously huge number, what you have to remember is that just because it's a huge number doesn't mean it's wealth. If you had 1 billion monopoly dollars, they're all just as worthless. Okay, so 4.2 trillion marks, just because it's currency that you're collecting and it's legal tender, 4.2 trillion marks was, it's, you couldn't buy anything with it. $1 was worth more back in those days, but you're not going to be able to buy much with 4.2 trillion marks. Okay, think how much you can buy for $1, and that's how much you'd be able to buy with it. Remember that the price of goods is always the price of goods, meaning that a price of a loaf of bread is worth roughly a loaf of bread when all other things being equal. So the only time that the price of bread would change, for example, is if there was a bread shortage and then there's high demand for it. Then bread will sell for more money. But generally speaking, in a time where all other things being equal, bread is worth bread. So the thing that changes over time is the value of money. How much dollars does it take to acquire that loaf of bread is really a better question to be asking. And then there's other insurrections as well. One that's really important, though, is the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923. And this is the time where Hitler tried to overthrow the government in Munich. And so this is one of Adolf Hitler's earliest notable historical events, I guess, contributions. And so the Nazi Party, which had gained a lot of traction in the times when Germany's economy was struggling so bad, the German economy had been so bad that people are looking for answers, and they look oftentimes to answers from the government. And they get angry and hostile. And so the Beer Hall Putsch happens because the Nazi Party, which was known as the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, but in German it's different words, is a group of far-right military, former military guys who try to stage this insurrection at a beer hall that they used to meet at in Munich. Now, it is unsuccessful. Hitler does not successfully overthrow the government, and the Beer Hall Putsch is put down by the Weimar Republic, and Hitler is put into jail. But the conservative judges that sentenced him sympathized with his anti-Republican views, his anti-Weimar Republic views, and his trial was an absolute circus. And he's making speeches and doing political stunts and stuff like that. and the judges end up kind of sympathizing, so they give him a light slap on the wrist. So he's given a jail term, but it's really not like, don't think it's like a, it's not Folsom Prison or something like that, okay? He's in a light workshop style prison, where you've got dormitories and stuff like that. It's not really it's not at all a harsh punishment, and it's during that prison sentence that he writes what would become the platform for his entire political career, which is Mein Kampf, which is the outlining of his fascist, far-right nationalist views, and also extremely racist views. Now, in 1924, well, let me start by saying that in 1923, after the Beer Hall Putsch, there's a new guy that comes to power in the Weimar Republic, and his name is Gustav Stressmann. Now, Gustav Stressmann is a good leader, and he brings some degree of stability to Germany because he kind of backs down. He tries to find a more amicable path for Germany in the global sphere. So instead of Germany doing things like shutting down workers in the Saar coal mines and other things like that, Gustav Stressmann tries to pave a way for Germany to kind of re-enter into the European geopolitical scheme of things. So he becomes leader in 1923. And the thing that's important to remember about Gustav Stressmann is that one of the ways in which he helps Germany's economy kind of get back on its feet is that he helps to broker the German government's deal with the United States of America, known as the Dawes Plan. So there was an American banker by the name of Charles Dawes. Okay, don't get him confused with Charles Darwin. Totally different people. Okay, Charles Dawes was a banker in America in the 1920s. And Charles Dawes suggested, well, if the United States government lent Germany a bunch of money, millions of dollars, that what this would do is it would effectively serve as like a prop to hold up the German government, which is weak. Almost think of it like a splint that they're putting on the German economy. Okay, so let's say you're walking down the road, you break your leg. Your friend that you're walking with says, "Oh my gosh, you broke your leg. Here, I have this, splint. We're going to wrap this around your leg here, and that will provide your leg enough support so I can kind of help carry you along." Well, it works. And the German economy, 1924, 25, 26, 27, 28, is doing significantly better. And this loan had gotten German industry going again. It had restored some of the people's faith in the government. And this results in, a German economic recovery, and people are feeling like, okay, like World War I was bad. Things were pretty hairy for a few years there. I don't love the Weimar Republic, but Gustav Stressmann seems to be doing a pretty good job, and some faith is starting to be restored. They had even they had planned on continuing that same plan, the Dawes Plan, because it had been working so well. And by the time that Adolf Hitler gets out of jail, he does not have the same level of influence. By that point, due to him leaving the leadership of the party during his jail sentence, but also, too, due to the fact that that sort of angry, far right-wing conservative group, the fuel has been taken from the flames from them, because they can no longer point to the government and say, see, they don't know how to handle our problems. If we were in charge, we could fix the problems. We would bring back the German economy, blah, 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 blah. So it takes a lot of the fuel from their fire, and it's kind of like they have dwindling membership by the time 1928 rolls around. The NSDAP is almost going, the Nazi party, is almost going to, collapse. It's going to fall apart because there's not enough angry people to be attracted to the party anymore. And then 1929 happens. And in October of 1929, the stock market crashed. And all that money that had been lent to Germany to prop up their economy for the past 5 years is now in question, because the American economy has collapsed basically overnight. So going back to that thing where your friend is helping along, imagine that you have your splint on your broken leg, and your friend's helping you along, and then simultaneously your good leg and both of your friend's legs break also, and now you're all just writhing in pain on the pavement. And that's basically the effect of the stock market crash, because it instigates the Great Depression. Okay, so, and by the way, as a direct reaction to that, the other side of that is that there was probably no one in the world happier than Adolf Hitler when the American stock market crashed. He probably jumped in the air and clicked his heels together, because this was going to be the indicator that perhaps he'd be able to start using those same arguments, old arguments that he had written out in Mein Kampf and had been seething about for years, about the anger of the Weimar Republic, but also about the failures of the German economy and the embarrassments that Germans faced after World War I. And he's able to re-tap into that anger and that fear and that uncertainty that all the Germans felt right after the war. They're feeling it all again 10 years later after the crash of the stock market. And that's really the thing that allows the Nazi Party to again start growing significantly in size. So, really, that's all I wanted to cover for today. For next time, we're going to be talking more about because now we're starting to get into the rise of totalitarianism and stuff like that. We do have a few other things that I want to mention, but I don't want to go into painstaking detail on all of this stuff, because I'm trying to move through this fast enough where we can kind of bring you up to speed on what's happened since World War I by the end of the year. So I'd like to get through interwar years, I'd like to get through World War II, and I'd also like to get through the Cold War, if we can. Now, to be honest with you, each of these are units that in Euro would have taken me weeks to cover by lecturing through it all. So I'm not going to be able to go into the level of detail that I would have had our school year not been interrupted. But I'd still nonetheless like to give you kind of a brief outline of kind of what's happened in history and the significant points of major developments throughout history as to how we got to where we're at today. So that's pretty much my goal from here for the last week or so of the school year. So anyhow, folks, I will be putting up today. I know I didn't do it yesterday. I can't even tell you how busy I was yesterday. I literally did not stop working all day long. And so I will be putting up assignments today, 2 assignments. They'll be, simple, basic assignments, just little things that I can give you points for if you decide to do them. And then those will be due on Friday. But I'll make sure to get those up for you today so that you can get going on them. Shouldn't be too tasking. All right, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in this morning, and we'll see you again on Friday.